Hi, Damai, welcome. You're listening to People, Planet, Food, conversations about the global food system that I hope are both a cause for optimism and a call to action. I'm Roger Robson-Williams, the Chief Sustainability Officer here at Plant and Food Research. I'm interested in how to grow healthy, enjoyable, affordable food in ways that don't harm people or planet. In this podcast series, I'm talking to some of the inspiring people I've met about what needs to change if we're to have healthy people living on a healthy planet and eating healthy food. In this episode of People, Planet, Food, I'm delighted to be talking with Vicky Foster, a leader in the UK food system whose career's focused on delivering impact from scientific research. Vicky started off as a PhD student and a scientist at the world's oldest agricultural research station, which is actually where we met back in the 1990s. From there, Vicky worked in the UK grain and seeds industry, making sure that industry-levy investment in research and development delivered tangible benefits to growers. Until late last year, Vicky was the head of the British Beet Research Organisation, a not-for-profit organisation providing the sugar beet industry in the UK with the research and extension activities it needs to thrive. Vicky is also a trustee of the Perry Foundation, which is a UK charity that promotes research and education in the food system. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and welcome, Vicky.
Thank you very much, Roger, and it's wonderful to be talking to you here out in New Zealand.
So we've been working together in my office today here at Plant and Food Research in Lincoln, which is, I think, the first time in about 18 years that we've shared an office space. And it's a far cry from the office we shared at the Homegrown Cereals Authority near King's Cross in London. So what's your connection with Aotearoa, New Zealand?
Well, Roger, for me, New Zealand is a really special place. In fact, we actually got married here 20 years ago. Myself and my husband, we love coming back here for holidays, to revisit places we've been to continue to visit new places, to catch up with friends and with work colleagues. There's just something about New Zealand around the people, the culture, the air, the countryside that we just love. It just feels really homely when we're here. Probably because I'm so passionate about agriculture and the outdoors. It just feels a very natural place to be, and it's lovely to be back again here in New Zealand.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to exploring some of your kind of observations about the difference between agriculture in the UK and here, but we'll have plenty of time to come on to that. So I reckon a good start would be if you could explain to listeners, a bit about your work in the UK food system and what's led you to do what you've done.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, I started out in research and with the Homegrown Cereals Authority. And basically my whole career to date has been involved in that kind of grower focus from the levy-funded organisation. So very much working on behalf of growers, and it's always been in that applied science sector. So I very much like to be involved in science that you can apply in practice in a fairly short time frame. So something that you might do in 3 or 4 years, a grower can actually do something and deliver it. And, it's really important we have all the fundamental science as well that happens in the universities and the research institutes, which is more long term. But to be able to build on that with something more near market to growers, I think is really important. And that gives me immense sense of satisfaction and gives me kind of value and purpose for what I do, knowing that, the organisations I work in can really make a difference. There's a huge amounts of pressure across agriculture and horticulture today, and this is globally, not just in the UK or in New Zealand. And I think it's a really challenging industry for people to be in and to work in, but it's such an important industry and one that we really need to value, and we really need to look after it and nurture it. And I think a lot of people don't understand how their food is produced and the challenges that farmers face today. So if I can be a little part of that jigsaw to help them continue to do what they do really well, that's just really important.
And I guess one of the reasons why our career paths have kind of crossed over the years is because we've got that shared interest in applied science to support the food system, which seems such an important and useful thing to be doing. Loads of questions immediately occur to me. One of them is what sorts of pressures, you alluded a moment ago to the pressures you see on agriculture and the food system. What specifically have you got in mind there?
Well, I think one of the huge pressures for growers today is just remaining in business. They're a business. They have to make a profit at the end of the day, whilst a lot of growers do what they do for the love of the industry and for the passion, and often it's something they've grown up with within their life. But sometimes we forget that they're a business like any other business, and they still have to make money. And, rising input costs, rising energy costs, things like we might think when we go shopping or when we're paying our home bills, they face the same challenge, but on a grand scale. And, huge investment in farms. And, if things go wrong, they can go drastically wrong. So anything that I think we can do to help support them and help them. And some things are outside of our control. Energy price, for example, might be outside of their control and outside of something that we could do as a research organisation. But actually, if we can help them to, think about their input costs, think about how they can maybe reduce things, be smarter with things, use new innovations, technology, new precision applications, etc., then, it's just being more efficient and more effective at the same time to support them.
Yeah, I think I agree that is a major pressure on the industry, and efficiency gains I think are absolutely essential, and we've seen over the years some amazing improvements in that regard, but I'm not sure that that's sufficient. And one of the things I've been reflecting on a lot recently is whether the price of food these days really reflects the cost of producing it, and that's obviously a massive issue to try and resolve. But simply expecting farmers to become more and more efficient and reduce their costs, I think it kind of seems like a bit of a race to the bottom to me. It's part of the jigsaw puzzle, but not the only solution. So just thinking, another thing you said that really interested me was, your interest in that applied research to make a real difference. And can you think of one particular thing during the course of your career that you're particularly proud to have been involved in that's created that positive impact?
Oh, goodness me. Wow. Gosh, there's been so many things that I've, be very pleased to be involved in. Some of the things, an example might be some of the sort of pest forecasting tools we did. So something springs to mind around sort of cabbage stem flea beetle, quite a long time ago, back in HCCA days. And actually, the crops can tolerate a lot more sort of beetles than you might visually see. And just being able to really work and think about thresholds and, actually understanding more about when chemicals can be applied or, are required. That a lot less product needs to be applied than growers might think. And there is a pride thing. I think people don't like to see, maybe crops that are covered in beetles or crops that are covered in disease. But actually being able to have tools that say, don't panic, this is okay, this is, a new threshold. And I can't remember specific thresholds, but, those tools that can really say, actually, the crop's a bit more resilient than we might think. It doesn't have to be perfectly clean all of the time to actually still do what you need it to do and have a good yield. So, that can, help with, input costs again, better for the environment, numerous things where something quite simple like how many beetles a plant can tolerate, in reality is really important, and a great example of how you can just kind of change dynamics and change thinking a little.
Yeah, nice. One of those kind of win-win situations for the bottom line and for the planet. Presumably that was in oilseed rape?
Yes, yeah.
Thank you. And I know I sprung that question on you, so that was quick thinking on your part. So can you just tell us more about your kind of personal journey into the positions of leadership you've had?
Yeah, so I've started very much out of my PhD and worked as a research manager at the HGCA, the Homegrown Cereals Authority, and then just kind of really enjoyed what I do and just kind of sort of developed and evolved my sort of pathway to then become a sort of a senior program manager and then become involved in kind of leading a team and then involved in kind of leading programs as kind of, I suppose I really kind of carved out, and I don't know how many times I rewrote my job descriptions and kind of really, I'm a firm believer in, we are in charge of our own destinies. And if we want something and if you've got the determination to do it, don't hang around and wait for something. If you want it, go out and grab it and take those opportunities. And an opportunity came up 7 years ago to lead the BBRO, the British Beet Research Organisation. And I thought, actually, I can do this. It sent a bit of a jump from a sort of a programme leader to a kind of a organisation leader. But I thought, actually, it's just putting it into context. So, what have I got to lose? Let's just go for it. And there are so many similarities, so many skills that, you're managing a team that then you apply. I've always managed the finance, managed activities, managed the strategy. So I'm thinking, I can do this. So I think having some self-confidence and having that drive and determination is really what's sort of pushed me through. I've realised and learned in my life that I don't have to be the expert in everything. And when you work in a team, that's a great thing. There's, what I said, there's no I in team. It's not about, I've got to know everything. Actually, I don't. I've got a fantastic accountant. I've got a fantastic head of science. I've got a fantastic communications expert. So as long as I can, pull all the strings together and get everyone working together and be cohesive, I think as you move into leadership, you realise it's not just about being the expert in one subject, which sometimes I think as scientists, we just get drawn down that rabbit hole a little bit that, we have to be the best and the perfectionist. And sometimes actually, I'd probably say I'm more of a jack of all trades in many ways. And I think that has helped me. And I very much enjoyed the journey that I've been on. And I look forward to that, to continue into the future and being able to apply my, my skills and everything I've learned for the next 10 years.
And I think when you took on that new leadership role, leading that research organisation in the sugar beet industry, you ended up moving home and horses and husband and dogs. Tell us a bit about that experience.
Yes. Well, generally, I think because I've been very passionate about my career, we seem to have sort of moved around up and down the country through my PhD and then down, working in London and then back out into the Midlands. But I guess always in a sort of similar-ish area. We'd been to Norfolk on holiday, and that's as far as we'd ever been to Norfolk, and it seemed like a million miles away from, the East Midlands. And we just thought, crikey me, do I want to kind of wholesale move? But, it was one of the best things we ever did because, it doesn't take long to, meet new friends, to meet new people. Actually, the most stressful thing was probably finding a home for the horses. Actually, finding a home for us was fairly easy in comparison. I like change. I think change is a good thing. Very rarely, you have change and something's bad. You don't always get it right. But normally, change is there and it's good and you should embrace it. And it can be scary and frightening. But I think it's good. So, moving everything seems quite daunting at the time. But, it's not long before you settle in and, and then you just kind of feel very at home and, very much got used to not having the hustle and bustle and the business of the Midlands and, just being in a much quieter place in Norfolk and very much we've enjoyed our time there.
And so Norfolk is the heart of the sugar beet industry in the UK?
Norfolk, on the east of England and, get sort of record amounts of sunshine, good sort of dry conditions. It's where you get a lot of the cereal crops as well, and a lot of the sort of hawk crops are on that east side of the country as well. And very much just really good conditions for growing sugar beet. So, historically, sugar beet was grown much wider across the UK, and I think there were 17 plus factories across the UK at one point, and now there are 4 factories that are predominantly focused in that eastern area because that's where the sugar beet area is really kind of sort of keenly grown. Interestingly, you can grow some really good sugar beet crops up in Scotland as well. There's microclimates up there that are fantastic, but there are no processing facilities up there, so economically it's just not viable anymore. So there is a niche of where the crops are going, and it is a really important crop in the arable rotation in the east of England.
And I do want to explore a bit more what's involved in kind of growing and processing sugar beet. So kind of what is the story with it?
Sugar beet's a really interesting crop to work with, and it's a really interesting bit of the industry to work in as well because it's quite unique to many other sort of sectors in the arable supply chain. As a crop, it's incredibly resilient to kind of weather volatility compared to some other crops, and it's quite a phenomenal crop. If it's got light, water and nutrition, it can just keep growing. It really is quite amazing. Of course, it has agronomic challenges like any other crop, and the various sort of pests and disease pressures that it does need looking after, but it's quite phenomenal how well it can recover from periods of sort of drought stress and heat stress. And you can watch it look like it's flat on the ground one day, and by the next morning it's ping, it's upright, it's there, it's I'm open for business, give me some sunshine, let me capture it. And it's a great little machine of producing energy and producing this wonderful root which contains all this energy and all the sugar. And for the supply chain, again, it's quite unique because within the UK, there is only one processor, which is British Sugar. So all of the sugar beet in the UK is grown on contract to British Sugar. So you have this very close relationship between the growers and between the processor. And obviously BBRO was the only research institute really promoted to work specifically for the sugar beet growers and to provide those with independent knowledge and information. And another kind of different thing unique to sort of the sugar beet sector and many crops is growers know exactly what they're going to get paid in kind of pence per tonne before they put it in the ground. So there is the contract price for sugar beet is negotiated annually between the National Farmers Union representing the growers and British Sugar to get a fair price for everybody. So, of course, you don't know what the year's going to be like. You don't know how many tonnes you're going to produce. So you don't really know what your profitability is going to be. But you know that potentially on your average farm and what you've expected previous years, kind of what you're going to get. So you can kind of take that risk a little bit. Like, is it worth me growing it this year at this price or not at this price? And a lot of the time, in a lot of products, you grow it and then you sell it onto the market at whatever that price might be. So it is quite different. And yeah, it comes with its challenges, but it's been an interesting crop to work in compared with the cereals and oilseed sector.
And what other crops would farmers who grow sugar beet also grow? So if they decided in one season not to go for the contract with British Sugar or just as part of their rotation, they're looking to grow something else in that paddock that year, what other crops would feature in a typical rotation with sugar beet?
Yeah, so sugar beet's a spring crop. So it fills that kind of spring crop block, but it'd normally be grown in there. There'd probably be some potatoes in the rotation. There might be some spring barley in the rotation. Oilseed rate's been in decline. It could have. It's probably taken quite a lots of slots where spring rape might have been grown in the past because that's had its challenges, and obviously amongst cereals and things. So the benefit is it's a fairly good solid spring break crop which can help with weed management issues, and obviously we still have quite a lot of resistant blackgrass in the UK, and by putting your spring crop in, it gives a chance to get on control of your blackgrass before your cereal crops go in. So it's an important break crop.
Yeah, and just for listeners who might not be familiar with it, herbicide-resistant blackgrass is a major weed problem in arable crops in the UK. Yeah. Not present in New Zealand or not a problem here yet?
I understand it's not been a significant problem. I think it does turn up occasionally here and there, and I think it's something that is monitored quite carefully, but thankfully not the issues that we have with it in the UK.
Okay, so we've got to talk about yields now, and I've got some stats here. I did a little bit of homework in preparation for this because I'm not at all familiar with the sugar beet industry in the UK, or to be honest, anywhere else. So I came across some slightly dated results from trials at the Templeton Research Station, which is actually was quite near to where we're sitting today. And this was back in the 1979-1980 season. And the fresh weight yields of roots of sugar beet ranged from 50 to 63 tonnes a hectare. They were looking at 7 different sugar beet cultivars. So it was 50 to 63 tonnes per hectare fresh weight. The dry matter was 22 to 24.9% of that fresh weight, and the total sugar was 15.4 to 19.5%. So obviously that's a few years ago now. How does that compare with the sort of yields the growers you were supporting in the UK were getting in the 2020s? Yeah, so
actually it's not that dissimilar really. So at the moment, the UK sort of average yield is around kind of 75, 80 tonnes per hectare, but that would be obviously average, and the different soil types can have a massive impact on the yield you get along with the season. And frequently there'll be many crops over 100 tonnes per hectare. You can get some really good crops out there, particularly on sort of the heavier land where they can retain more of the moisture. It might be 60, 65 tonnes you might get on some of the lighter land. So yeah, higher, but then you'd kind of sort of, maybe if you were looking at today's figures in New Zealand, perhaps they would be higher than that as well, because obviously breeding and agronomy has helped to push yields up quite a lot in over the last 10, 15 years, where a lot of the yield of a lot of crops and cereals have stagnated. Actually, the yield in sugar beet has continued to increase, and there's been some really good work from the breeders there. Thinking about, dry matters, probably in that kind of 22-25% range, so quite similar. A mean sugar yields probably around about 17 to 18%, again depending on the season. If we've had some good sunny weather and they're able to put lots of energy down into the roots, you'd get those higher sugar contents. A couple of years ago it was a very dull summer and we were struggling to get 15%, and then that's really difficult on the grower then. You'd be looking around, there's around about 100,000 hectares of land growing sugar beet in the UK, around about 2,500 growers that service those contracts, and that supplies around 8 million tonnes of sugar beet into British Sugar, out of which they produce around about 1.2 million tonnes of sugar a year. And to put that into context of what the UK requires, that provides about 50% of the UK's sugar demand, and the remaining 50% comes a split between around 25% from imported sugar beet from other areas in Europe, and 25% comes from imported sugar cane. So there is a processing facility for Tate and Lyle in London, which produces sugar from sugar cane. So there's no sugar cane grown, obviously, in the UK because of the climate, but there is a processing factory which allows them to be processed and packaged in the UK, whereas the sugar beet is all grown and contracted to British Sugar. And that supports around about 7,000 jobs in the UK economy. So, it's not an insignificant amount of sort of crop or jobs that industry supports.
Yeah, I had no idea it was that large a proportion of the UK's demand for sugar came from homegrown sugar beet. And I would imagine that sugar beet on a global scale is a relatively small component of overall global sugar production, and presumably sugar cane.
Yeah, sugar cane, there's some big producers of sugar cane, in sort of, Brazil and sort of, India, China, parts of America. It's obviously, it's a much bigger crop globally than sugar beet. But in Europe, there's some really, Germany, France, there's some big sugar beet crops out there as well. In comparison in the UK, I suppose we're quite small because we're quite a small island, so there's only so much that we can produce. But there is a good sugar beet industry in Europe.
Yeah, and I think I'm right in saying that in New Zealand we do grow some sugar beet, but only for fodder, and in particular I think in the dairy industry. I'm pretty sure we don't have any kind of New Zealand homegrown sugar beet industry for sugar production, but I'm sure if anybody listening to this knows otherwise, I'd be delighted to hear from them and get that fact straight. So you mentioned that it's a resilient crop, which I can see being a real advantage for growers, and it's my understanding a resource use efficient crop. It's deep rooted, it's good at scavenging for water and nutrients and so on and so forth. What are, if any, the main kind of sustainability challenges with growing sugar beet? When the conditions are good, then it's a very good crop. If it's dry, so if we have sort of, particularly dry springs at that critical growing phase, then actually that can be a challenge. So, the roots need to kind of sort of get down to depth to be able to, kind of pull up that water. So that great taproot is brilliant if it's dry later in the season, but early in the season. So if we get drier springs, then that could be a real challenge for the crop. And again, if it's sort of too hot for too longer periods, and it kind of sort of, the leaves drop, and they land on the soil, they can actually get burnt quite easily from the soil and die off. So if as long as it's not there for too long, it can take a reasonable amount of drought. But if there's lots of really hot, dry weather, and the canopy can sometimes struggle to recover then if the leaves get sort of burnt and die. But actually it's amazing, as I said, if there's just short periods of really hot weather, a bit of rain and it pops back up, and it can just keep growing. Sometimes that can be to its detriment, because actually if you can get a bit of sort of a bit of rain or sunshine a bit later in the season, then it's like, yay, I produce loads more leaves. And actually that's at the time coming towards harvest in the autumn. You really don't want it to produce in loads more leaves, because you want all that sugar going down into the roots to the bit you're going to harvest. You don't want it to use that energy to produce more leaves. So there comes a point where you're like, okay, Mr. Sugar Beet, you've done your thing now, you can stop growing, just keep storing that sugar.
So that's, I suppose, a bit about the plant per se, but I think if we think about the system, then I think one of the biggest challenges really to the crop is around soil, unfortunately, and it's maybe not the most friendliest crop to the soil, particularly from a perspective of soil damage, particularly if the conditions are not very good. So due to the nature, so a typical sugar beet root will be about 1 kilo to harvest, so it's quite a big lump to pull out the ground. And so as a result, the harvesters are generally very big pieces of kit, because particularly if they've got their own sort of storage on board. So these are, I think combine harvester were massive till I started sugar beet harvester, and they are vast. They really are kind of huge, which obviously that's a lot of weight, a lot of ground pressure on the soil. So as things have got bigger, and I think sometimes we can get wowed by big shiny actually not always big is best. So but you're limited to what you can do, and that there really needs to be some sort of innovation, if ever possible, around harvester design, if there's anything that you can do. I mean, there are certain elements around tire pressures, around a kind of control traffic farming to try and put the pressure onto just certain parts of the field. But you get real problems when it's a wet winter and a wet harvest, particularly the way the sugar beet is sort of delivered to the factory. Growers will often have slots where they have to get their sugar beet in because the factory's got to keep processing all the time. So sometimes in some years, growers will harvest when they know they really shouldn't be, because they're under pressure from the processor to be able to deliver in a slot, because the processor's under pressure to keep the factory full and going all the time. So if you do it when it's too wet, then it literally can obliterate your soils, and you're left with slush when it's been through, and it's off, and that takes a long time to put right. If you break down your soil structure to that degree, that's not something like a 1-year rest is going to make it better. So it can get a lot of bad press for the damage that it does to soil. But obviously, if you do a lot of work on your farm to have sort of soils that are in good health and good organic matter content, then that's going to, minimise that to some extent.
And it raises a really interesting question for me. Your kind of challenge: is there a possibility? Is there a technical intervention here to address the heavy machinery, harvesting machinery issue? And in New Zealand, there's a lot of interest in electrification because we've got a highly renewable electricity grid. Farms have, subject to having the available capital to invest in it, huge potential to generate a lot of their own energy through either ground-mounted or rooftop solar. One of the problems with electric vehicles tends to be, compared to the internal combustion engine version, they're a bit heavier because they have a battery for energy storage, obviously. So if you've got an already large and heavy, high-powered or a machine that requires a lot of energy to operate, and you're trying to convert that, the chances are you're going to be heading in the wrong direction from a weight perspective. But I wonder if there's something in future around smaller, lighter, automated harvesting that maybe doesn't require a human operator to be sitting on. Anyway, that could be a subject of a whole other podcast.
Yeah, or maybe, we're going to be sat here in 20 years' time and there's going to be like sort of hovercraft type harvesters, and there's going to be, machines that, that they're not even on the ground, they're above the ground, because all the harvesters do is they literally pluck the roots out the ground, like, these sort of big discs that go around like a bit of tweezers and pop them out. So actually, who knows in the future, there could be something that flies above the ground and literally pulls them out and, chucks them into a hopper somewhere. I don't know. Technology is moving that fast. We should think that there's never going to be any innovation, because there could be some out there in the future. At just this point in time, it's difficult to see what that is.
Yeah, and I guess that sort of technological innovation is an intervention at a point in the system to try and deal with a particular problem. Another, perhaps a more systemic approach to it might be to say, if the sugar beet processor and the farmer worked in a slightly more integrated way as a system, it wouldn't be in the processor's interest to cause that soil damage. And so the trade-off between keeping the factory running at full capacity and damaging the soil might look a bit different. So there could be, by looking at it from a more systemic point of view, another way of addressing that problem, or at least ameliorating it to some extent. But just building on that point, Roger, it's almost a victim of its own success, because it will keep putting on yield, it will keep growing through the season, and we know it will. And you'd only apply historically 2 fungicides to keep your crops clean, whereas now you can look in at 3, because it can
grow for that much longer. If you keep it cleaner, it will keep growing. So of course, from the processor's perspective, the longer it's in the ground, the bigger roots they're going to get, the bigger yield they're going to get. But you're also a higher risk of the weather, whereas in sort of days gone by, you might have been perhaps you were lifting them all out maybe by September or something. So you wouldn't have clashed perhaps with some of those weather conditions. So again, are you better off accepting a lower yield and, not having the cost of the damage to your soils, which then might affect your yields for your other crops in the rotation, than just going to, to kind of get the biggest yield you can get. So I think you're quite right. I think the balance is in the system. You could take it out sooner, have a smaller yield, have lower input cost, possibly not get paid so much for your beet crop. But then if you're not spending so much on it, again, the whole thing around profit margins, it's not about, the biggest you can get if the cost of producing that is excess compared to a smaller yield. So yeah, interesting times.
So we've got this interesting plant that's good at intercepting solar radiation and turning it into sugar. That's something useful for us. How does that beet, so we're thinking about a gnarly looking 1 kilo plus root, grows with a big green top on it. How does that turn into a bag of refined sugar? And what are the sustainability issues, if any, associated with that part of the process?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, so in the UK there are just 4 processing plants now, and they're all in the kind of the East Midlands area where the sugar beet industry is, and they're all by rivers. So you'll find they're all kind of perched on the river, and actually the rivers were probably transport ways in early days when the factories were developed, but they take water out of those rivers because one of the first steps in the process is actually washing the beet. So as it comes out, in some years they can have a lot of soil on them, they can be quite dirty. In other years they can be, cleaner. So, the first thing when you've got this sort of gnarly, particularly mucky root, is clean it. And, they have massive cannons that, shoot water into the piles of beet as they come off the back of the lorry, and they wash all the soil off them. So then you've got nice clean beet to then enter the factory. So once the beet's been washed to remove the excess soil, then it goes into the factory, the tops are taken off. So all the green matters that have taken, if there's anything that's left on there, is taken off. And then it's basically sliced into little thin strips, which they call, strangely, cassettes. But you just get these sort of like long little sort of cubes of sort of sausages of sugar beet. And from that, it's then mixed with hot water, and that starts to help extract the sugar out of the beet. So you end up with a kind of a juice that contains all the sugar. And then, from various processes, that's centrifuged, and that pulls the crystals out. It basically spins the sugar crystals out of the juice. It can then be washed again, and then it's dried. And then you eventually end up with your sugar product that you see that goes into the silos, and often a lot of that will go into bulk tankers. So the majority of British Sugar's product goes into tanker loads, bulk tankers for the likes of sort of Unilever, Coca-Cola manufacturing. And then actually the white bagged sugar that you'll find in the supermarket is a very, very small part of the business and of the process. But that's the bit we're most familiar with, because as consumers, our bags of Silver Spoon are the bits that we see. So it does use quite a lot of water that's sort of taken out of the rivers to wash and clean and process. But actually, we said it's 25% dry. So actually a lot of that sugar beet is also made up of water. So there's a lot of water in the system. And then the water that's been used during the process, then that's kind of sort of refined, it's clean. The factories have got various kind of sediment pools and treatment operations. And then that water is then ultimately put back into the river. And when I did my undergraduate degree a long time ago, I actually did my year in industry at the Newark sugar factory, and one of my jobs was testing the water in the various pools and testing it when it came out of the River Trent, and testing the water quality before it was put back into the River Trent. And yeah, I don't know if it's surprising or not, British Sugar were putting their water back into the Trent in a better condition than the water they actually took out of the Trent. So, maybe there was some benefit there, but maybe the Trent's, cleaner these days than it was a long time ago. I wouldn't like to say. So the water's the key thing, but it does get kind of, recirculated back into the system. And then really as a kind of a crop and a processing crop, it's quite a successful story from a sustainability perspective, because the pulp that's left over when the sugar has been extracted, that's collected, that's dried, and that's processed and goes into animal feed market. the soil that's washed off the sugar beet, that's collected, that's spread on big pans, that's dried, that goes into kind of amenity sector for sort of gardening and land and other kind of sort of land uses. All the stones that are collected as part of that are cleaned and washed, and they're bagged, and they go into aggregates, they go into the industry. So for every tonne of sugar that's produced, there's only around 200 grams of waste product. Now that is phenomenal, and you never really think of, actually that whole system. And alongside the sugar that's and all the co-products that are produced, actually also the steam and electricity that are produced during the process are collected as combined heat and power, and they also go into other industries. So there's the biggest British sugar factory at Wissington has next to it a huge, and it was until reasonably recent, the biggest single glasshouse facility in the UK. And for a while it grew tomatoes. Now it's used for medicinal products. So the combined heat and power actually is pumped into the glasshouse. So that byproduct is also then used to power another industry, plus of energy going into kind of local communities as well. And some of the pulp is also used to feed anaerobic digesters, which also generate green electricity on the plant. So it's a very clever system with very little waste products, and in that sense of, if we think about sustainability, so it does actually tick quite a lot of boxes.
So just to be clear, then it's the waste heat from the processing that can be essentially reused, have a second life in terms of either that heating those glass houses or going into other community kind of heating or power. Okay.
Instead of going out the chimney, like steam would have done, in days gone by, now it's actually captured, and so they use that heat and they can use it in other processes, which is again, pretty good. So has any work been done looking at the relative kind of social and environmental impacts of sugar beet as a source of sugar versus sugar cane? Yes. I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of work done in that, and it will probably depend on what country where you are in the world as to what people might say is the best, because, I guess they both have pros and cons. But if we think from the UK perspective and within Europe, then, that's where we grow predominantly sugar beet. And sugar beet requires around a third of the water to grow than sugar cane does. So, and beet has a shorter growing cycle. It has generally a slightly higher sugar content, and obviously, beet, as I said earlier, is a good rotational crop, and it is saline tolerant, which is different to cane, and that's because its ancient relatives come from wild sea beet. So, and in the UK, obviously the market there, it also wins on its carbon footprint, because a lot of that 50% is homegrown. So it's grown in the country. It's, it's not being bought in from excessive distances. So it doesn't have that sort of transport cost associated with it. So, but as you say, it's a big industry and a big employer, but likewise, cane's a massive employer for people in Brazil and other countries as well. But environmentally, it's perhaps a bit less resource intensive than perhaps cane might be. Yeah,
and I'm not trying to set up some hideous competition between the two. Just genuinely interested in. I've recently been looking into planetary accounting as a way of understanding from an environmental point of view, the kind of life cycle assessment of different products and processes, and it would be pretty interesting to apply that process, which is essentially taking the 9 planetary boundaries, these Earth systems that we require to be stable for a prospering civilization, taking them and translating them into what that means for the impact of a given business or product. And your comments about back in the day in the Trent, the water going back into the river being better quality than the water coming out is a nice example of how businesses can not only cause no harm, but contribute to a net kind of restoration of kind of ecosystems and nature. So it would be really interesting to see that. Anyway, thinking about the product itself, sometimes you hear it said, and this is coming, kind of sugar's the new smoking. There's an epidemic of non-communicable diseases, many related to poor nutrition, and high fat, high sugar and high salt content in ultra processed foods often is pointed to as being, a significant part of the problem. I'm sure you're going to have views on sugar and diet and human health, and I'm really interested to hear what they are.
Yeah, and obviously, in the UK, a few years ago, the sugar tax was introduced to try and, reduce the amount of sugar in products. Yeah, and it is a very controversial topic because obviously there are big negative impacts associated with human health. But like I think most things that we talk about, as long as things are consumed in moderation, generally there's not a problem. So you could say the same about salt, the same about, carbohydrates, the same about fat content. If you have an excess of anything, it's never going to be good for you. So as long as, everything's in moderation, then, I think that's the most important thing. And, we need sugar. Our bodies need sugar. We can't survive without sugar. And sugar isn't all about, sugary drinks, sweets and cakes. And that's often when you're talking about sugar tax and sugar being bad and, children eating too many sweets, etc., drinking too much pop that's high in sugar. It's not just about that, but that's obviously the headline grabber, and that's the easy thing to say, boo, sugar's bad. Sugar's also involved in many more things. It's involved in lots of different flavourings, in colourings, in various texturings in the food market. So it's used to make things soft, it's used to make things crunchy, it's used to make certain foods more pliable, it's used as a thickening agent, it's in syrups and jams. And what I really think is also interesting that probably people don't think about is actually it's used quite a lot in the pharmaceuticals industry. And you wouldn't necessarily associate that with sugar, but, it's things like, making medicines taste a bit better, that sweetening taste of medicines, that coat around tablets to make them easier to swallow, dextrose solutions in IV fluids, in high concentrations, it's a natural preservative. It's a key ingredient in many antibiotics and vaccines. And obviously, insulin is a key part of insulin, which many people rely on to stay alive. So, sugar is important. It's an important industry, and it's not all just about cakes, sweets and fizzy pop.
Yeah, I guess the question is, how do you grow an industry without that kind of implying the need for a growth in consumption of something that's unhealthy, and perhaps the substitution of a less environmentally sustainable imported option might be a reasonable argument. But that's the conundrum, which then brings you to the question, actually, does such an industry even need to grow, or is it actually the right size for this point in history? That's probably a whole other podcast in itself.
And I think, you can also say, well, why do we need to grow sugar? We can produce synthetic sweeteners. So why do we even need to, have this crop which is in the ground and doing damage to our soils? But I know for me, I'd any day rather take something that's naturally produced with very, very little sort of processing and refining and no additives over something that's kind of chemically synthesized any day. We know what sugar is, and as it is, it's a great product. And there's what you see, that white granular sugar, there's very little, there's nothing else in it. It's crystals, it's very easy, it's a very pure substance. So yeah, I guess it's down to preference at the end of the day, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's an interesting, your observation that it's a useful preservative as well. And obviously, jams and such like are an example of that, is something in my own home that we kind of recognise. And right now, as we're trying to store produce from the garden, using quite a lot of sugar to help us with that. So your whole career is about helping create sustainable opportunities for growers, and you've done that in a couple of different industries now. What steps are you taking, if any, in your own life in relation to becoming more sustainable?
I think when you work in the industry and you understand an industry and you're familiar with the challenges and the hard work that's going on in that industry, I think only natural, I suppose, it makes me think a lot more about, my food and where my food comes from, and, what I buy, and, I spend more time looking at labels in supermarkets and, where things have come from, and, different times of the year, and, sometimes we'd have certain food products that would only be seasonal, whereas now you can pretty much buy anything all year round. But, you don't even think about it sometimes, and you think, oh, yes, I'll have some blueberries to go on my breakfast today. And, where on earth have these come from, sort of a million miles away. And, we it's great in some ways, we have access to this food. But again, you sort of think, well, actually, do I need to eat that certain product at this time of the year? Should I be looking to eat more food that might be more seasonal and might grow? And so I think I look at labels a lot more. I look at, where my food's grown. I like to be able to support the local industries. I'm not, specifically an organic person. I think, organic's a great thing, and I think that has a role to play. But, I think there's also a place for, sort of plant protection and fertilizers when they're used appropriately. And I think for me, again, it should be part of that integrated system. And it's nice to know where it is and where, growers are taking responsibility. And, there are sort of various environmental standards now, and in the UK, a famous one is the leaf mark, linking environment and farming, and that's something that that they've had to stick to certain standards and think about the environment a bit more and a bit more around sustainability to get that accreditation. So I think if you know more about these things and understand them and appreciate them, then they're the sorts of things that you start to look for a bit more. And that's kind of, I suppose, around the food side of things, which is very close to. But at home as well, we have solar panels on our house. We have no gas or oil at all. We are purely electric there. And I think as a result of that, we think very much about what we heat and when we heat. And when you've got central heating, sometimes I think it's easy just to turn it on for the whole house and have everything a little bit warm. Actually, we have our kind of fire in the evening downstairs, and we don't heat the rest of the house. We just heat the room that we're in. We very much enjoy kind of recycling things, renovating things. I love going around the charity shops, buying things, buying clothes, sending clothes back, the kind of sort of, I suppose, the vintage area of us kind of, why throw things away if things aren't broken, or just because we don't like something anymore, then actually someone else may well like that. So I love the whole kind of secondhand thing and sort of reviewing things and reinventing things. And even down to our cars. We've saved a number of old vintage cars. We have a collection of old Volkswagens, and we sort of minimal tinkering and work. We keep these on the road and we enjoy them, and I'm sure there must be something in there in keeping some of these old cars on the road. Okay, they're not daily drivers necessarily, but surely that's better than them ending up on a scrap heap somewhere and, kind of just sort of being discarded. So we enjoy, I guess, recycling things and just continuing to enjoy stuff.
And I think you probably hinted at the answer to the next question, but any listeners who were interested in trying to take steps to make sustainable choices about their food consumption, what would you suggest? What would your kind of call to action for them be?
Yeah, I think for them, again, take more interest in where your food's coming from. Look at the product labels when you go to the shops, look at where it's been produced. If there's information about how it's been produced and in different ways, then, take an interest in that, support your local producers, not just some of the big, sort of cooperatives out there that are really all about, kind of sort of making the money. Actually, it's important we support small farms as well. And look at different environmental sort of marks and schemes if that's something that's important. It's one of the best kind of sort of natural ways to control sort of pests and things in the disease is to really look after the good things, look after the good pig, the ladybirds, the beneficials, the parasitic wasps. There's things out there that we need to look after, the flowers you put in your garden, the food sources you have, to look after these and nurture these good beneficial insects, because they're going to eat some of the nasties that are on the crops. That means that you don't necessarily have to be applying the protection products. So think about sort of what you're doing. And I'd just say, support, if you have local producer markets, go and support them. You're cutting out some of the middleman in the process as well. And, that, a lot of your money is going more direct to the producer as well.
Well, that sounds like great advice to me. Have you got a book or a podcast or a documentary or any kind of resource that you'd say to people, I found this really useful, take a look at this?
I tend to kind of learn more about things by meeting people, by talking to people, by going to events, meetings, conferences, local shows, all bits and pieces where you can kind of chat with people. So I tend to enjoy those things more than maybe, certain sort of podcasts or books and pieces. So for me, it's just about, just talking to people and learning from others and just taking an interest in things that you enjoy. Yeah,
it's great advice. Final question, and I ask all my guests this question, and I've had just the most wonderful range of answers to it, and I think I'm going to collate them at some point and sort of publish them. If you had one superpower to make the food system more sustainable, what would that be?
Well, it's probably quite predictable from me, from what I've been talking about today, and probably not revolution. But if I could wave my magic wand, it would be to restore all our soils to a good ecological health and then make sure we look after them. Actually, people are much more mindful about the importance of looking after soils now, but unfortunately we've spent such a long time of intensive farming and, kind of destroying the structure, destroying the microorganisms and not looking after them. It's now taking a long, long time to put them back into good health. And whilst there's some brilliant work going on, it's going to take a long time till we get there. So if I could do one thing with my wave of the wand, it would be return them all to good condition, because I think today we will look after them better.
That's a really, really wonderful answer, and it makes me reflect that should you ever find yourself living and working out in New Zealand, you will find a lot of friends that would agree with you very strongly on that. And in particular, I hope perhaps even on this visit you get the opportunity to meet with Angela Clifford, who just co-hosted an event that was called Underground and was all about soil health and regenerative practices to build up that kind of vital resource. So that's you have not let me down there. Thank you, Vicky. That's just a wonderful superpower to want to appropriate. And in some ways, through your work in different ways, I feel you're kind of already appropriating that to some extent. So thank you. Look, it's been a great discussion. Thank you for taking some time out from your relatively short visit this time to record this podcast.
That's lovely. It's been great to speak to you, Roger. Thank you.
Thank you. Have you given me a cause for hope? Yes, you have. All sorts of reasons. I'm struggling to move on right now from your suggestion there of a superpower to restore soil health. But other things you've said, and actually reflecting on your comments about the sugar beet industry in the UK, and whilst it has its issues, it is an example of going quite a long way to make a process circular rather than a linear and extractive one, notwithstanding those concerns about soil health. So thank you for that. Have you offered a call to action? Yeah, very clearly. Think about what you're eating, think about where it's coming from, think about how you can support local and sustainably produced food. So thank you for that. And for you listeners out there, thank you so much again for listening to this episode of my podcast series. If you're interested in more of these kind of conversations about people, planet and food, please subscribe to Sigest and rate and review the show. That really helps. And please share with others that you think might be interested in these topics in this series. And in particular, and I always say this, if you've got any questions or suggestions for people that you think I should have a chat with on this show, please contact me on sigest@plantandfood.co.nz. And look out for upcoming episodes which I have in mind for 2025, all aimed at trying to make our food system healthier, fairer, more resilient, and a force for environmental good. Thanks for listening, and until the next episode, Mā te wā, see you next time.